everybody. Hi, how are you this evening? It is Gretchen here with Story and Art, and I'm surprised, I'm doing a premiere because guess what? The kids are coming out for a dinner and before they move. And I know they're not leaving town till this weekend, but this was our chance to have them come out. Family, get to see my daughter before she moves to Phoenix, get to hug my grandkids one last time, and you guys know me. I couldn't resist, so I'm hopping on to record a story for you because I did promise you part 1 of Blue and Yellow, and I'm not going to fall down on that promise, but I'm probably about the time you're watching this, I'm reading a story to the kids or talking or doing something like that with the family. So thanks for being here, and thanks for understanding that that's where I need to be right now. But this story, okay, I have to split this into 2 parts because I chose to do emphasis on a special author named Robert McCloskey. Now, probably if you saw his name on the front of one of these books, you'd go, oh yes, I know that person. But you'll know right away. Robert McCloskey is the 1942 Caldecott winner for Make Way for Ducklings. And later on, he did another book too that is going to be tomorrow night's. But tonight, I've got the yellow of the Blue and Yellow, and I'm going to do Make Way for Ducklings. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about this amazing man. I have this cool book here on Caldecott celebrations, and he is the first author that pops up in this. And it says, you have to rather think like a duck, Robert McCloskey once told a friend, when you put together a book like Make Way for Ducklings. He said in his acceptance speech for the Caldecott, I spent the next weeks on my hands and knees armed with a box of Kleenex and a sketchbook, following the ducks around the studio and observing them in the bathtub. What? How do you get to that in your acceptance speech? And why were they in the bathtub? Well, I got kind of curious. It says he was growing up as a boy in Midwestern manufacturing town of Hamilton, Ohio. He played the harmonica, oboe, drums, and thought about becoming a musician. Like his father, he also enjoyed tinkering with machines. Like his mother, he liked to paint. Happily for him, his parents encouraged these interests. He was a teenager when the Great Depression began, a time when money and jobs were scarce. During his high school senior year, he won a scholarship to study art in Boston. He says, but for that scholarship, McCloskey later said he might never have left Ohio or become an artist. And during the Depression, artists had to be ready to do almost any kind of work. He tried his luck as an oil painter, watercolorist, muralist, and commercial artist. He then remembered a childhood friend had an aunt who published children's books in New York City. McCloskey went to meet the editor, May Macy, of Viking Press. After looking at his portfolio, Macy urged the young man to keep drawing, hired him to illustrate a book jacket for Viking, and invited him out to dinner. That evening, Robert McCloskey dined on duck. So May Macy was among the most gifted editors of her day. In that first meeting, she recognized the young visitor's talent and sent him away with a good advice to draw the things he knew firsthand instead of the stuffy, mythological scenes that he thought a serious artist was supposed to draw. 3 years later, Massey published McCloskey's first book, Lentil, in 1940, with a story loosely based on the artist's own Midwestern childhood. But as a student during the 30s, McCloskey enjoyed strolling in the Boston Public Garden. with its fanciful swan boats and resident families of ducks. By 1939, he'd moved to New York. When a job brought him briefly back to Boston, it occurred to him that a story about a peaceful life of the garden might have a promise as a picture book. Without a definite story in mind, McCloskey spent hours in the garden, sketching and observing the daily goings-on. He heard about a family of ducks that had stopped traffic as it made its way through the nearby streets of Beacon Hill. This incident, which had been reported in the local papers, was the story he needed. McCloskey wrote a picture book based on the anecdote and sketched a dummy. Back in New York, May Macy once again offered encouragement and agreed with the artist that he would need to learn a good deal more about ducks before he would be able to draw them well. So what would you do if you needed to learn more about ducks? Over the next 2 years, he studied mallard specimens at the American Museum of Natural History, discussed duck anatomy with an expert on birds. Still not satisfied, he bought some live ducks at the city market to serve as models. 16 ducks eventually came to live with him. He had 2 other artist friends also sharing his apartment with him. And they said, ducks wake up at the break of day and don't want to sleep anymore either. They raised a terrible racket. They ate a kind of feed called mash the artist brought home in big sacks. And there came the Kleenex, the tissues. They had to follow along behind him and the ducks cleaning up. The artist would want, for instance, to know what the underside of a duck's bill looked like when the duck was in flight. To find out, Samant recalls, McCloskey wrapped one of the ducks in a towel and put it so its head spilled over the couch, and then lay on the floor and looked up and sketched it. He made hundreds and hundreds of drawings. And it says, I'll show you here on this. Bring this down a little more, some of the sketches in here. Here's some early sketches that he did of ducks. It goes on and talks about how much it was never exact duplication, but the feel of the place he was after. Here is a detailed drawing for the scene depicted on page 7. He wanted to do it in watercolor, but the editor was worried about the cost of printing a book that was twice as long as most other picture books. And he went on and he drew the final versions directly on sheets of zinc, a kind of metal used for printing. Drawing on zinc, which is a darker color than drawing paper, made it harder for the artist to see what he was doing, but working this way saved money and simplified the printing process. Pretty amazing. Let's see if you can get that. I'll brighten that up a little bit for you. Yeah. There we go. Yeah, look at that. Anyway, it's pretty amazing. Make Way for Ducklings went on to become one of the best loved of all American picture books, as well as one of children's books most closely identified with an American locale. In 1987, the year of the Boston Public Gardens' 150th anniversary, a bronze sculpture of Mrs. Mallard and her children were placed in the garden in celebration of the gentle story that had become inseparably linked with the image and life of Boston. I'll read more about him tomorrow night, when I do the other book. So, are you ready? I'm going to push this back up so you don't see that. And it's time for the book now. Make Way for Ducklings. Make Way for Ducklings, Robert McCloskey. This is a wonderful, cool book because it's all done in this monotone really wonderful color that I've been trying to use in some of my sketches I've been doing. Awarded the Caldecott Medal as the most distinguished American picture book for children in the year of its publication, 1942. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were looking for a place to live, but every time Mr. Mallard saw what looked like a nice place, Mrs. Mallard said it was no good. Foxes in the woods or turtles in the water, and she was not going to raise a family where there might be foxes and turtles, so they flew on and on. When they got to Boston, they felt too tired to fly any further. There was a nice pond in the public garden with a little island on it. The very place to spend the night, quacked Mr. Mallard. So down they flapped. Next morning, they fished for their breakfast in the mud at the bottom of the pond, but they didn't find much. Just as they were getting ready to start on their way, a strange, enormous bird came by. It was pushing a boat full of people, and there was a man sitting on its back. "Good morning," quacked Mr. Mallard, being polite. The big bird was too proud to answer, but the people on the boat threw peanuts into the water, so the Mallards followed them all around the pond and got another breakfast, better than the first. "I like this place," said Mrs. Mallard as they climbed out onto the bank and waddled along. "Why don't we build a nest and raise our ducklings right in this pond? There are no foxes and no turtles, and the people feed us peanuts. What could be better?" "Good," said Mr. Mallard, delighted that at last Mrs. Mallard had found a place that suited her. But "Look out!" squawked Mrs. Mallard, all of a dither. "You'll get run over." And when she got her breath, she added, "This is no place for babies. With all these horrid things rushing about, we'll have to look someplace else." So they flew over Beacon Hill and round the State House, but there was no place there. They looked in Louisburg Square, but there was no water to swim in. Then they flew over the Charles River. "This is better," quacked Mrs. Mallard. "That island looks like a nice, quiet place, and it's only a little way from the public garden." "Yes," said Mrs. Mallard, remembering the peanuts, "that looks like just the right place to hatch ducklings." So they chose a cozy spot among the bushes near the water and settled down to build their nest. And only just in time, for now they were beginning to molt. All their old wing feathers started to drop out, and they would not be able to fly again until the new ones grew in. But of course they could swim, and one day they swam over to the park on the riverbank, and there they met a policeman called Michael. Michael fed them peanuts, and after that the Mallards called on Michael every day. After Mrs. Mallard had laid 8 eggs in the nest, she couldn't go visit Michael anymore, because she had to sit on the eggs to keep them warm. She moved off the nest only to get a drink of water, or to have her lunch, or to count the eggs and make sure they were all there. One day, the ducklings hatched out. First came Jack, then Cack, then Lack, then Mack and Knack, and Oack, and Pack and Quack. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were bursting with pride. It was a great responsibility taking care of so many ducklings, and it kept them very busy. One day, Mr. Mallard decided he'd like to take a trip to see what the rest of the river was like further down. So off he set. "I'll meet you in a week in the public garden," he quacked over his shoulder. "Take good care of the ducklings." "Don't you worry," said Mrs. Mallard. "I know all about bringing up children." And she did. She taught them how to swim and dive. This is my favorite picture in the book, by the way. She taught them to walk in a line, to come when they were called, and to keep a safe distance from bikes and scooters and other things with wheels. When at last she felt perfectly satisfied with them, she said one morning, "Come along, children, follow me." Before you could wink an eyelash, Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Oack, Pack, and Quack fell into line, just as they had been taught. Mrs. Mallard led them way into the water, and they swam behind her to the opposite bank. There they waded ashore and waddled along till they came to the highway. Mrs. Mallard stepped out to cross the road. Honk, honk, went the horns of the speeding cars. Quack, quack, went Mrs. Mallard as she tumbled back again. Quack, 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 went Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Oack, Pack, and Quack, just as loud as their little quackers could quack. The cars kept speeding by and honking, and Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings kept right on quack, quack, quacking. They made such a noise that Michael came running, waving his arms and blowing his whistle. He planted himself in the center of the road, raised one hand to stop the traffic, and then beckoned with the other, the way policemen do, for Mrs. Mallard to cross over. As soon as Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings were safe on the other side and on their way down Mount Vernon Street, Michael rushed back to his police booth. He called Clancy at headquarters and said, "There's a family of ducks walking down the street." Clancy said, "Family of what?" "Ducks," yelled Michael. "Send a police car, quick." Meanwhile, Mrs. Mallard had reached the corner bookshop and turned into Charles Street, with Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Oack, Pack, and Quack, all marching in line behind her. Everyone stared. An old lady from Beacon Hills said, "Isn't it amazing?" And the man who swept the street said, "Well, now, ain't that nice?" And when Mrs. Mallard heard them, she was so proud. She tipped her nose in the air and walked along with an extra swing in her waddle. When they came to the corner of Beacon Street, there was the police car with the 4 policemen that Clancy had sent from headquarters. The policemen held back the traffic so Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings could march across the street, right on into the public gardens. Inside the gate, they all turned around to say thank you to the policeman, and the policeman smiled and waved goodbye. When they reached the pond and swam across to the little island, there was Mr. Mallard waiting for them, just as he had promised. The little ducklings liked the new island so much that they decided to live there. All day long, they follow the swan boats and eat peanuts. And when night falls, they swim to their little island and go to sleep. And that's the story of Make Way for Ducklings. I love that book. I have loved this book since I was very, very young. I mean, I remember vividly seeing it in the library. I remember vividly borrowing it and taking it home. Yeah, great book. Great, great book. And it stands the test of time. It is one of those that I think partially because it's not done in color, and it's that whole idea of the ducklings that crossing the street and everything. It just is just the cutest little story. So that was part one of Blue and Yellow, and part one with Robert McCloskey, an amazing, amazing man who brought us this book and so many more that he had. He says, living with the birds prompted another change. In the dummy, McCloskey named the ducklings Mary, Martha, Phillies. The dummy was the first book that he put together to send to the editor. He named them Mary, Martha, Phillies, Theodore, Beatrix, Alice, George, and John. Obviously, in the final version, he changed the name. As he worked on the illustrations, he trimmed the text, letting the pictures tell more of the story. The story changed in other important ways, too. In the dummy version, Mr. and Mrs. Mallard lived in Boston from the start and simply returned home from their southward winter migration in time for the coming of spring. In the final version, obviously, the Mallards do not yet have a safe home in which to raise their family. So it's really wonderful to see. I love that about this book, how it talks about how the editing process went through and it became the book that we all know and love today. So folks, thanks so much for being here and listening to Story and Art tonight. Story Family, I wanted you to have this wonderful book, and I'll be back tomorrow night live with part 2 of Blue and Yellow, another book by Robert McCloskey. You might guess. If I've done yellow tonight, blue tomorrow, you might be able to guess which one is tomorrow night. But until then, keep looking for the beauty hidden in plain sight. It's all around you. First place you'll find it is if you go look in the mirror and say, "Hi, beautiful." But then go out and share that with other people. Until next time, folks, I'll see you.
All we need is a place to be and a few good friends for some company. If you'd like to stay, you don't have to leave. We'll leave the lights on and the door unlocked. If you drop on by, you don't have to knock. We're happy to share whatever we've got.